Well, I want to turn to my colleagues for further questions and thoughts. I mean, I do want to address the condition due issue, and I'm going to look to you all to correct me. I appreciate the recommendation that we not deal with it today. I certainly don't want to deal with it today, but I do want to say that those things aren't in there to mess. I come from local government. It's not to mess with local land use. These things are put in to be inconvenient, because the goal is for us to not be in this situation and for the community to get off the Carmel River. And the context we're in is that we've allowed an ongoing violation for 20 years in recognition of the fact that it was challenging. And I sometimes I don't want the graciousness on that to be seen as either paper tiger or tiger, scary tiger, whatever. Rampaging tiger. It is a very difficult situation, so I think coming together is important, but things like moratoriums and these kinds of measures are not uncommon as placeholders when somebody's in violation. I just want you to know it's not a weird thing where we just decide to mess with it. That said, I'm open to a staff recommendation of how to talk about it, because it may be the details of it aren't necessary, but having it just go away wouldn't work for me. But I'm mindful of the fact that new development can come in and end up using less water than others, and that this particular language may create odd situations. But again, I would be against just taking it out in this meeting or directing you all as to what you ought to do in any given period of time. So I'm open to suggestion depending on other folks, but it's not an outrageous measure to have in something. There may be better measures, there may be an argument against it, but it's not a ridiculous measure to have there. There are other issues, but I wanted to wait till everyone was done to lay that out there. But let me turn to my colleagues, because sometimes it's faster if I let them all talk first.
On that particular issue, I think we heard some recommendations that I would support in terms of just directing staff to work with the stakeholders, develop, appropriate options, and come back to us within a certain time frame.
I'd like to get some information from staff. I looked for the letters, wasn't able to find them. So I would just like to hear a little bit more about the history of, what triggered the guidance letters to begin with. Perhaps this is something that could be addressed at the staff level, since it was put together, and it seems that it was put together originally at the division level.
Yeah, confusion doesn't help anyone, so.
No, thank you. And correct me if I'm wrong, John. I know John and I have been working with this issue for several years with many of the people in the room. Mariana, a little less so, but we're happy to have her help. We were asked repeatedly by the Monterey Peninsula Water District to clarify Condition 2 several years ago, and the result of that was the 2012 letter, and we were asked for further clarification after that, and we provided that in 2013. So that was at their request. We had believed that that information had been communicated to others and that we were all working on the same page. So we were frankly a little surprised to see people indicating this was new information to them, because it was at the request of the local agencies that we provided the information. So all we did in this order was to carry through that guidance that we had believed to be the framework for the way we were operating today and in the past years.
That is correct. As a matter of fact, the California PUC had ordered CalAm and Monterey Peninsula Management District to consult with the State Water Board back in 2012 to develop a select a workable protocol for determining the past baselines. Mm-hmm. So CalAm sent us a letter of proposal baseline, and we responded to that letter. That is the April 9th, 2012 letter. So that letter, and then a follow-up letter was sent to the district afterwards. That's the the 2013 letter. So we were responding to the ordering section that is in 2009-060, and there was,
which everybody should be aware of.
Right, and that condition was imposed by the board specifically because of the non-support of past projects by the communities.
Yeah, it just seems to me that we may not, as far as process, we may not necessarily need to bring it back to us for approval. It seems that it could go through the division. I mean, this was based on a request initially that came from the local agencies. The concern that I would have is that whatever is done, that it be well communicated, but I would imagine that the district or the division could, work with stakeholders on that, and then maybe just bring it back to us as a report.
Yeah, if I were to make a suggestion in terms of how the board would navigate this particular issue, first of all, you've heard multiple requests for section 5.3.1.5 to be removed from the order, and frankly, it can be without any damage to the order. There's certainly a clear discussion today in terms of what the history was, in terms of how it read in the initial draft that went out and why it's being removed. I think there's a clear record that condition 2 is in 2009-0060, regardless of whether 5.3.1.5 is there. And as Board Member D'Adamo pointed out, there are potentially multiple paths forward here. And rather than at the request of some of the stakeholders who were come back to the board in 60 days with a change, I mean, frankly, reading between the lines, what most of them were asking for is a change to condition 2.
Right.
What I would just suggest is that the staff work and report back to the board within 60 days, and at that point in time we can evaluate whether or not we need to take some sort of action path or whether it's been resolved by the stakeholders and the Division of Water Rights, and that could be encompassed in the motion that the board made with respect to today's proposed actions.
Right, and some of it could be in terms of simply being even clearer on certain things. There are a number of speakers, and particularly one of the most recent speakers about the missed milestones and things like that, and having a more public, not process, but more public outreach on where we are on these things. I thought that was actually a valid point.
And with respect to that, I would just point out that the way that the reports are set up, if there is an issue of a missed milestone and a potential that is beyond the control of the applicants, recall that it is currently set up in the draft order that there would be a publicly noticed board meeting before the board, which would provide the opportunity for anyone who had a contrary view on whether or not it was within California American Water Company or other applicants' control to present to this board. And only after that public meeting would this board make any kind of determination that the $1,000 missed milestone debit, if you will, or 1,000 acre feet. Did I say dollars?
$1,000 would go really quick.
No, 1,000 acre feet missed milestone debit.
Half this room would volunteer that. You see them waving money in the back of the room.
But in
pay
those
into the
hearings,
pot.
we could
It is to pay to
substantively
us.
discuss potential fines, and that's something that's provided for in the authority in reviewing whether milestones are missed or provisions of the CDO are not met.
Well, I guess I would be a little bit careful to say that if the board, obviously there's a different process for assessing penalties through the administrative civil liability complaint process, and so if the board
Yeah, we can't just
wanted to provide some
toss it
direction
in.
that it would like to have a hearing on that issue, that would be
That's what I mean.
an appropriate
It could
venue
set
for
it up, right? It wouldn't be a direct
Correct.
result. Yes, that was
Yep.
my point.
I'm assuming, and then stop me if this is an inappropriate question, because fines is one of the things on the list that was suggested. We obviously couldn't do it here, but I'm assuming the reason you didn't suggest fines is because you're proposing an extension to the CDO, and you're proposing it in light of all that whole set of layers of progress that's been made despite the missed milestones on the big projects.
As Mariana pointed out earlier in one of her pieces of the presentation, we had hoped to focus the community on the projects and investment in the projects. And so why fines are obviously an option for the board, we had recommended that the energy and the money be focused on those projects.
On getting over the finish line on projects.
Yeah, and that's clear. You've listened to this board in that regard, that when we get a proposal with broad support from many perspectives on an issue, I know personally that's very important because that shows a buy-in from the different perspectives. And so I think that's powerful, and I listen when a broad coalition comes forward with alternative approaches. So as Mr. Minton pointed out, there can be a framework that can help folks get together and hammer out solutions. So I certainly want to encourage that in any decision we make.
I have a couple of questions of staff.
Oh, sure.
So looking at the CalAm PowerPoint and their second slide here on carryover credits, they spent a lot of time on that, and then also the joint annual report. So maybe the easy one first. Question about the joint annual report. Reporting should start with the second milestone. I realize that's right around the corner, and so maybe there should be some change to that, but to wait until the second milestone. I think there's a fair amount in the order on reporting, aside from the milestones, some useful information. And so could staff comment on that?
Certainly. It would be a relatively easy fix to say that the two reports that would be influenced by CalAm's request would be the reports on progress towards milestone 1 and the report on the state of the fishery for water year 2015-2016. And staff is certainly open to postponing that because the deadline is in 2 weeks. Certainly the fishery report seems as if it would be difficult to pull together by then. And then the second report, if there is actually a delay I see 3 options. The first milestone is very straightforward. The CPUC issues an approval of the matters before it regarding pure water Monterey or not. And so, that could be done. They could very easily get a report that says, yes, we got this approval on this date, although of course any reconsideration would not yet be over. Any reconsideration period, I'm assuming. And then, or there could be a postponement of the schedule, in which case they could say, well, we still don't know whether we're going to hit the milestone because we haven't had the hearing yet. The date of the 31st, I think, I don't see on that particular milestone a lot of added value out of sort of anticipating whether you're going to get it, because I think there's no way to anticipate it. It's an adjudicatory process. It's ongoing in the CPUC, and it depends on their schedule. It's not as if a delay will indicate a different outcome or give us more information about a different outcome. It's different than, hey, we failed to get X, Y, and Z construction, or wow, this permitting process had 75 comments and we don't think we're going to be able to get through it. So I don't have a problem with delaying that first one. In terms of the state of the fishery report, I think it's, we could set an earlier date for that first status of the fishery report and make it independent of the annual milestones report, or we could just put them both to, I believe it would be the summer of next year to get both.
What's your recommendation?
I had drafted language that keeps them together. I hadn't thought about the idea of getting a status of the fishery report earlier. So my recommendation would be to keep them together and to say, okay, we can move forward with this at the second milestone. It's a delay of about 9 months.
Summer of 17.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. All right, and then my second question had to do with carryover credits. One of the reasons I was asking about other projects is that, my strong sense is that I have just seen since my short time on the board that the community has really come together. And so I think we're all pretty hopeful about these milestones, but I think it's important always to have a plan B. And so plan B would be whatever other projects are out there. And that's exactly what we've been pushing for through the California Water Action Plan. We're looking for, just every opportunity, especially local regional solutions. So I'm thinking there's got to be other things that are out there anyway. And so looking at, this issue of credits, kind of falls into that, and that is, what do you do, when you get these additional sources? And I think that staff has struck the balance on the carrot and the stick. I understand the argument that's being made that you want to give the locals an incentive, but the very point behind having the EDL is that should be incentive enough. And so I'm not inclined to make a difference there, but I'd just like to have your comments since, we heard so much on this issue.
Yeah, we would not actually recommend changing from a hard cap at this point in time. One of the, this is where sort of the discussion we had about why we originally suggested 79.90 comes into play. So the numbers that they're using don't reflect the new accounting for the ASR. They're hopeful that with the changes in the ASR that can start producing an average of 1,300 acre-feet per annum. Well, again, that's an average. You can't certainly count on that in every year, and that certainly hasn't been the case in the last 5 years. But even looking at the last 6 years, which have not had particularly heavy winter rains, it does make a difference in what the sort of average amounts are to be looking at the ASR differently. Another project that seems poised to go online momentarily is the water recycling plant in Pacific Grove. So that's 125 acre-feet per annum, which is sort of an additional amount of give that's not taken into account. And then the Malpaso water is not something that's been taken into account over the sort of the 6-year averaging period. So I don't think that it's will be necessary for them to go above the 8,300 in order to maintain the balance. And so I wouldn't recommend changing that.
You can almost think of it as insurance instead of credit. That if the milestones start falling apart as they did in the past, if history is any guide, that by investing in these forbearance style or small projects, that it creates insurance for CalAm and the stakeholders as opposed to a credit.
Just an issue of messaging. It doesn't really, I don't think it's a disincentive that they're not given credit. I like the approach, the board member Moore, that it's insurance, and so it really is an issue of how it's messaged. Okay.
I think we're being generous and going to 8310. I'm not quite at TAMS, but
No. I think
I'm only willing to because of the seaside drop and
Yes.
all these good things, including the forbearance agreements, including the fact that Jonas is for it when he's been there from the beginning, and he can be as tough on anybody as anybody I know. No matter how tough the rest of you think you are, you're not as tough as Jonas. And the fact that you've brought him on board is a big deal, but and others. I don't mean just Jonas, but you know what I mean.
I'm just say I'm glad we're not going there because that would tip me over to a no vote. I think staff is being extremely generous
very
as it
generous.
is to take a 6-year average or a 5-year average or whatever, rather than just going with the last level of diversion, because we are talking about continuing illegal diversions.
And I would also underscore the idea, particularly of communicating with the community, that this is insurance. If you go above and beyond with some of these very small projects, not that you get carryover on the 8310, but again, history being, we have lived with this history, and we have not met our obligations to the river and to the fish. And so,
or to the water rights system, which in other forums everybody is screaming at us to implement. Here we're implementing and trying to be graceful about it, but
so
it's
I
not a
think
small deal.
Go
Convenient, but not a small
forth
deal.
with these extra projects, and they may get you through missing even by a few months, these milestones, or maybe even a few years. So I agree. Let's stick with the hard cap and move the reporting to the second milestone.
The performance of Monterey Peninsula has been exemplary in terms of water conservation in this state, and then this coming together of trying to not be so fragmented, but be more holistic. And so I think we can show some deference to that. It's very difficult seeing, a CDO deadline not met for me, and I've struggled with this, and this, I can maybe circle back a little to the condition 2 discussion. When I look at that performance over the last few years, I think condition 2 has played a role.
Right.
And I don't think the folks that are commenting against it or are just narrative description of it are giving it enough credit. I think we did have one commenter here that alluded to that. Mr. Coletti, I think, pointed that out, and I think it's part of the success of the peninsula. It's belt and suspenders, but this is an enforcement setting on water rights and harms to fish and wildlife, and belt and suspenders I'm comfortable with. However, I'm also comfortable with what Mr. Laufer suggested, which is we can get rid of language in this proposed order, but I wouldn't touch condition 2 in 2009-60. I think and I think there's a strong history of the water boards in using these type of approaches to get the attention and to get folks to work together. We did that in San Francisco with hookup connection bans in the 70s. Sometimes it's necessary to get folks to work together to solve common water problems and set aside their differences to have this type of framework. Now, I think we can continue to work at the staff level to do the reasonable thing at the local level. Everything I've heard and read in the comments, I've read every comment letter. I heard all your comments. I think we have room to move within this framework of condition 2. But we were supposed to solve the problem by the end of this year, and condition 2 would have gone away. And so there has to be some consequence for not meeting the CDO. So I think we need to just continue to work, have reasonable outcomes that save water, promote education, all those great things. But I would be against removing condition 2, but I would be for removing the narrative language in the proposed order. In fact, I'd be prepared to make a motion.
But before you do,
Wait.
may I exert my limited division chief role for one nagging priority question?
If you'll stay 5 minutes longer than you planned, you can say whatever you want.
Well, as we have several rodeos going on,
Yeah.
and several ball games and several ballparks, I just...
But no neon miniature golf.
No black light. I'm still trying to visualize it, though. And because 1/3 of our CalAm focus group here will not be here in a few weeks, I would think that 60 days would be a difficult task for us to complete.
Oh, yeah, what would you
discussion. I would think we would need at least 90 in order to do that, even perhaps more. So I just wanted to make sure our expectations were aligned, that we really don't have the staff to, just even setting up a meeting. The coalition is, because they've brought so many people together, that means it's a challenge just to get meetings scheduled and
I think it's
discussions
good talking
going.
to more than the coalition more broadly for everybody's good ideas about how to at least be clear about it, different options. So.
Yeah, so I would just ask for a little bit more time, because those that will go beyond me, after me, will need to have a little more time.
Yeah, you can't go till you solve it. I guess so you don't have that authority either.
I'll let my family know about that family vacation.
That authority. So, okay. But do you all need time? Do you all need time to think about everything that you've heard? I mean, there are other things. I think some of the points made by some of the ratepayers are intriguing to me, but it is a challenge of what our job isn't to step in and micromanage the use of either moratoria or growth limits are ways to bring people together, but we don't get to just create a perfect world.
Yeah, I think and I don't think we need any time on the language. Ms. Owie has some language that she can read very quickly into the record on the joint report timing for the second milestone. But I think the biggest thing from the ratepayers that I heard today, besides, fundamentally the concerns that they addressed, the one that I think is clearly within our bailiwick, that it's probably not ripe and timely now for the board to address, but the concern that they expressed about how any future penalties might be passed through. And I think ultimately that is a determination of the PUC whether or not a penalty should be passed through to ratepayers. And like I said, CalAm's going to have to make a decision whether or not the corporate parent, if there ever were penalties down the road, would even apply for that. But if this board, were to ever impose penalties on California American Water Company for violations of the cease and desist order and for the illegal diversions, I think that would be the time where this board could try to shape its message and influence how the PUC looks at those particular penalties. And that lets you take account of the circumstances at that particular point in time.
All right, so we're not totally powerless at all times, but at that time we could make it some judgment should
Correct.
we choose to do so.
Ultimately, the PUC will be the arbiter of that, but to the extent that a board in the future wants to help shape how the PUC looks at it, I think that would be the proceeding where we would do it when penalties are actually imposed.
Were you going to read any recommended language into the record?
Yeah, I was going to recommend that we adopt the order and resolution as proposed with the following amendments, that in section 3B, Roman numeral 8, right after the heading Joint Annual Report, it be amended to say commencing in water year 2016-2017, and then that sentence would be switched from capital A to little a, at least 120 days prior to each milestone deadline described in condition 3BV, et cetera, et cetera. So that would clarify the date issue. And then I would recommend that we delete from the narrative section 5.3.1.5.
All right, I would like to move.
And renumber accordingly.
Yes.
So for people following along, that would be on page 19 that we'd be striking that section and renumbering accordingly. And then the changes on the joint annual report are on page 24. And any motion by the board would include the 60 or 90 days
Direction
for
to
the
staff.
staff to report back.
Good.
In the
I move.
resolution.
Excuse me?
In the resolution. The 60 to 90 day period to report back.
I think we can do it in the motion.
Yeah, it can be in the motion.
Okay, so I will move staff recommendation and also note that Monterey is spelled with one R. So let's make sure that we get that throughout
Houston, this nation.
in California.
In California.
And also there's, we're extending the order 5 years, not 6, as is stated on page 12. And with those changes, I would move adoption of staff recommendation.
And you'll direct staff to,
And direct staff to, as you stated, report back in 60 to 90 days.
I think it's ultimately, Deputy Director Evoy has suggested that staff will need 90 days to work through these issues with the locals, so.
Yes, and will that be an executive director report, or we're going to get a board item?
I figure we would report on the appropriate venue. If it's an amicable resolution amongst all the parties, I'm sure it could be reduced to an executive director report, unless everyone wants to come for a party.
Good.
So,
Okay. Moved as staff recommends.
Second.
Any further discussion?
I'm just happy to be able to vote yes.
Yes. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, it carries. Thank you all for your time and attention. Even those of you who we didn't give what they wanted. That was a very good conversation.
Marcus, can I ask one clarifying question? I personally have had some confusion about how ex parte rules apply with the direction to staff. I assume we can talk to staff.
I assume so. Wait, let's look to
Come off.
Michael. Michael, ex parte would end with this?
Yeah, I mean,
Can they
at this
talk
point in
to staff
time,
about
the item today likely is subject to petition for reconsideration, but based on comments that I've heard, I'm not expecting one. So until such a petition is filed and the scope of such a petition is determined, I don't see any reason to maintain the ex parte prohibition.
right, so staff can talk to everyone
Very
and
much.
should talk
Much
to
appreciated.
everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if you're accepting add that there's been much discussion of stakeholders, and a point we've been trying to make is that we are not stakeholders. Does that require an invitation?
Oh,
from
no,
you?
my intention is that they talk to you as well.
So I'm glad if that clarification is
Yeah.
in the record, please.
Yeah, it's the intent. Okay, if you all, we're actually not adjourned yet. We're going to recess. My suggestion is that we recess till tomorrow and move the executive director's report and board member reports to the end of tomorrow. Any objection? No. With that, we are in recess.